Hello, wellness students. Welcome to, I guess this is week 12. So, wow, we're moving right along this semester. And this particular presentation will be on the topic of boundaries. And, at the time that I'm doing this, I've received some responses to the discussion question for last week that was asking you if you felt comfortable setting boundaries and to give me some examples of boundaries. And based on what I have at this point in time, what it looks like to me is that those who have posted do understand the concept of boundaries and what boundaries are. Um, in this particular presentation, we're going to be looking at what boundaries actually help us with, how they help us, what are the different types of boundaries, what are the benefits of boundary setting, and what the symptoms can be if we're not establishing effective boundaries. So, one thing about this topic that I really believe to be true is that this is an area that most of us are practicing throughout our life. Establishing effective boundaries um, is definitely a skill, and it's a skill you get better at by practicing. Um, Also, with regard to establishing boundaries, what I'm sure you've found, and you'll probably continue to find this, is that with some individuals, it feels pretty easy to establish boundaries, and what you get in return is cooperation, and the other person really demonstrates respect for the boundary you've established. On the other hand, if you haven't experienced it already, you're going to experience it in life where there are times where you'll need to be establishing boundaries with other individuals that may not be as cooperative, or it can feel definitely more challenging and difficult to do so. So yeah, I think that this is one of those skills that most of us are working with over the long haul for the duration, and I think it's a wonderful thing to get introduced to, at least in college, if you haven't already been introduced in the past. So I do hope you enjoy this lecture because this is more material that I think is just so applicable to life, and I have a hunch that most all of you, or probably all of you, will really be able to relate to this. Now, sometimes the definition of boundaries is just described this way: boundaries are our way of teaching others how to treat us. And I kind of like this definition, this really simplified version that, hey, when I establish boundaries, this is how I'm communicating to you what I want, what I don't want. Um, and here's another quote that kind of goes along with that idea. And it says, "You teach people how to treat you by what you allow, what you stop, and what you reinforce." And reinforcement, that's an area that I think we want to be really aware of. Um, if, for example, I want to reinforce the things that I want, and how I can reinforce those things that I want, it can be sometimes just very simple by actually acknowledging that you appreciate or that you're thankful for that. And I think that's an important piece that we need to remember, that it is important to reinforce what we want. Um, Kind of on the flip side, though, we need to be really careful and take a look at, are we in any ways maybe reinforcing things that we don't want? And I think one of the really common ways that that happens is when we don't speak up, if we're just quiet. So in other words, if someone is doing something that we don't especially like or appreciate, if we say nothing, we may be in a more passive way reinforcing that, I guess you could call it bad behavior. So I think this reinforcement aspect of boundaries is really important to stay on top of. So here's another definition of personal boundaries. And I'm going to go ahead and read this to you. It says, boundaries are guidelines, rules, or limits that a person creates to identify for themselves what are reasonable, safe, and permissible ways for other people to behave around them. And also, boundaries are identifying how they will respond when someone steps outside those limits. So, you know, and you can just begin to maybe think about with family, friends, and partners, what are the guidelines, rules, and limits that you have established? Um, and, a lot of those may be spoken limits. They may be things that you've actually expressed. Some of those boundaries sometimes operate a little more as understandings. Um, but I think this is a pretty good definition. I also really like this second bullet point. A person with healthy boundaries can say no to others when they want to, but they are also comfortable opening themselves up to intimacy and close relationships. So let's look at this next side. Boundaries sometimes get described in three different ways, and you might think about yourself. Um, do you do you have some boundaries that might be classified as rigid, porous, or can you look at most of your boundaries and say, hey, really it seems that my boundaries are actually pretty healthy. Now, a rigid boundary, individuals who tend to set rigid boundaries are going to have a more difficult time with this aspect of things, being comfortable opening themselves up to intimacy and close relationships. So, see, with rigid boundaries, avoids intimacy and close relationships, unlikely to ask for help, has few close friendships, very protective of personal information, may seem detached, even with romantic partners. And they tend to just keep others at a distance, and sometimes that's related to fear of rejection. So, you might just look at that overall picture of you, and is it possible that the way you're establishing boundaries is more so in this rigid category? And then there's this other category that gets referred to as porous. And this is almost the opposite with porous boundaries. In other words, porous is something that bleeds through. Um, a person with porous boundaries is going to overshare personal information. And that oversharing could happen something like this. When you first meet someone or when you don't really know someone very well, tending to overshare personal information. The idea here is that we share a little bit at a time and are checking along the way to see how the other responds, to how the other person responds to our sharing. That oversharing personal information, that's considered a porous boundary. Difficulty saying no to the requests of others. Being overly or over involved in others' problems. Being more dependent on the opinions of others. One of the fun um, projects or activities I've sometimes asked students to do in class is to see if they can go for the next week and not ask anyone else for their opinion. And Sometimes students will say, well, I don't ever ask anyone for an opinion. That won't be tough. And so I'll then toss in and say, okay, then see if you can go the next week without giving someone else your opinion. And so I think that's kind of an interesting piece to look at. So can you make your own decisions? Or are you pretty dependent on asking others what their opinions are? Porous boundaries would include accepting of abuse or disrespect. So, in any way, are you allowing yourself to be abused? And that could be um, emotional or physical abuse. And I just want to emphasize if that's happening, that is very concerning. And it might be really, really important to talk to someone about that. Um, the other aspect of this is accepting disrespect. Okay, and this final one fears rejection if they do not comply with others. Comply means go along or follow the decisions of others. And then if you look at this third column, this is where it's describing healthy boundaries, valuing your own opinion, does not compromise values for others, shares personal information in an appropriate way, does not under or overshare. You know what you want, you know what your needs are, and you can communicate them. And you're able to also accept when others say no to them. So, yeah, so just think about this. In general, where do you think you fall? Is your struggle more so with rigid or porous boundaries, or do you really at this point, with the connections that you have, feel like you've got some really healthy boundaries going on? Now, with boundaries, and there were some responses already on the discussion board. Um, I guess it would be for this past week. That was tapping into the different types of boundaries. In the resource that I use, they talk about 6 different types: physical, intellectual, emotional, sexual, material, and boundaries related to time. And I like just pointing out these different types of boundaries because I think it can help us understand the scope, like the degree to which we set boundaries in our lives, that we set them in a variety of different areas and for a variety of different reasons. Those physical boundaries are related to our physical space and personal touch. Establishing boundaries with regard to whether or not you want someone to hug you or actually be that close to you physically. Okay. Intellectual boundaries are related to thoughts and ideas. And this is where I think it kind of gets interesting. Yes, we actually are establishing boundaries that are related to our thoughts and ideas. They may be healthy ones, they could be rigid ones, they could be porous ones. Yeah, so this will be interesting to look at. We set boundaries with regard to our emotions, our feelings, with regard to sexuality. Material boundaries, well, we're talking about boundaries related to our money and our possessions. And with those time boundaries, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with these, they're boundaries related to how we're actually going to use our time and how we allow maybe others to occupy our time. So let's just look at what are considered to be some boundary violations in these areas. With those physical boundaries, a violation would be if someone touches you and you don't want them to, or when they invade your personal space, and that could be your bubble, your comfort zone, or it could be your personal space as in your bedroom. Okay. Intellectual boundaries. Okay, so if there's a violation going on with intellectual boundaries, that's going to be when someone dismisses or belittles your thoughts or your ideas. And I bet that all of us have experienced that. And so I think it's kind of nice to understand that that is a boundary type of issue. It's a boundary violation. And as we get into this later, you're going to see that, yes, you do have the right to speak up when that happens. Now, a violation of your emotional boundaries might be when someone criticizes you, belittles you, or invalidates your feelings. They might even tell you you don't feel that way, or you're just being too sensitive. That's considered a boundary violation. Now, a sexual violation is a little different than the physical. Um, a boundary violation in this area would be if someone's trying to pressure you to engage in some type of sexual touch or sexual acts, if they're leering or staring or gawking at you, or if they're making sexual comments. Those are all boundary violations. Um, when it comes to material boundaries, here's the example: when someone steals or damages your personal possessions, or maybe when they pressure you to give them something or to let you borrow something. And then I think time violations, I bet a lot of us understand when someone demands too much of your time. So hopefully in listing these 6 different types of boundaries and what a violation might look like, um, it maybe gives you an even broader perspective of all the ways that you're teaching other people to treat you. And it might also help you lean into that examining aspect of what you might be reinforcing. Are you reinforcing the things that you want? Are there areas here with these 6 types of boundaries that you are potentially just staying silent and not speaking up if a violation is going on in one of those areas? Okay, so if you're not sure if any of your boundaries are being violated, I included this slide. Some of these slides are a part of a stress management lecture that I give on this topic, and I included this in the stress management lecture this semester as well because I thought this was so good. If um, a boundary is being violated, there is a tendency for us to feel one or more of any of these types of things. That feeling violated, sometimes feeling powerless, feeling like we're being used or disrespected, like we're not seen and we're not heard, um, perhaps taken for granted, unappreciated. So, I think this is a pretty good list of the feelings that can occur when we aren't establishing boundaries, if our boundaries maybe need some adjustment or work, or if someone's violating our boundaries. So you might think about in your relationships, in all of your relationships, is there anything that's going on with those relationships where you are feeling any of these types of emotions? And if these emotions are going on, I think that's a good signal that that would be a good signal for me that I would need to step up and speak and specifically identify what it is that I want or that I no longer want, and make that very, very clear. One thing that I think is worth tossing in here is that um, if we aren't establishing healthy boundaries, kind of a side effect of that is going to be that we're going to experience a lot more stress. In fact, there's a strong correlation between poor boundaries and stress levels. Those of us that have a difficult time establishing those healthy boundaries tend to experience more stress. And I tossed this in because I just really like this statement. And I have to tell you, I do not know who Robert Bernay is, but whoever he is, I thought this was pretty good. It says, the purpose of having boundaries is to protect and take care of ourselves. We need to be able to tell other people when they are acting in ways that are not acceptable to us. A first step is starting to know what we have a right to protect, or the first step is starting to know that we do have a right to protect and defend ourselves, and that we not only have the right, but the duty to take responsibility for how we allow others to treat us. And I love the way this is stated because it's very empowering. It states at the bottom, we're allowing others to treat us. So we are still in control. We are not powerless. We get to change the rules if the rules need to be changed. So, why is it that it's at times difficult to speak up and set those boundaries? Um, why do we allow it? And why do we sometimes set them, but then we don't enforce them or uphold them? And some of the real common reasons for not doing this, well, the first two are related to different types of fear of rejection, or ultimately it could be abandonment. If I change the rules or if I speak up on behalf of myself and basically in a nutshell say, hey, I want to be respected, I'm afraid that the other person may reject me or leave me. So that's one of the barriers. Another barrier is fear of confrontation. I know that some of us probably do not feel comfortable with confrontation at all, and that can be a real barrier. Um, in in healthy relationships, there is going to be confrontation, and there will be disagreement. And the idea is to navigate those times with, these really appropriate, high quality communication skills. And if we're afraid to approach something that may result in a disagreement or some confrontation, that's going to inhibit our ability to actually have a healthy relationship. So, but this does end up being another one of those barriers. Some people, when it comes to barriers, it's more about guilt. They just, for some reason, feel guilty about asserting themselves. They may feel like it's selfish in some respect. And I think we have to come back to, those that first week that we did social wellness, those skills that you need to develop if you want to be able to participate in a healthy relationship. One of them is mutuality. It's understanding that my needs are as important as the other person's needs. And, the guilt would be irrational to think that you, for some reason, have to sacrifice your needs in an attempt to keep the other person happy. And if you heard the way I said that, you can probably, right off the bat go, wow, that's messed up to do that. So, but guilt, for some of us, that can be a real barrier. The other thing, and I think this is, pretty commonly a thing, um, some of us maybe just weren't taught healthy boundaries. Maybe we didn't get to experience that as we were growing up and moving into adulthood. And it's hard to learn this stuff, especially early on if you've not seen it modeled for you. Um, And then this last concern, and this one would be another one where if this is a barrier, I think this is a real big time red flag. If you have safety concerns, if you feel like for some reason um, that speaking up could mean that you could end up being physically hurt or physically challenged in some way. Um, this type of a concern, again, I would encourage if anyone experiences this, that they talk with someone about it, because this is very, very serious. So these are just typical barriers that people experience when it comes to speaking up and establishing boundaries. And I always like to mention this because it's a question that comes up on occasion in class. Do we really need to speak up? Shouldn't some of this stuff just be common sense? Um, that the other person should just know? And do we really have to ask for it and tell them? And I would say that, you know, it's probably not a good idea to just assume that it should be common sense. If you have a need, that it should just be common sense, that the other person should be able to recognize it or mind read somehow. So I would always suggest erring on the side of expressing, even if you do think it should be very clear or should just be common sense. We don't all have the same common sense. Okay, so a few more slides here, and what I've done is I've done a little bit more separation with just this whole idea of boundaries. We use boundaries to communicate our wants and needs. And keep in mind too that we get to communicate those, but that doesn't guarantee that the other person will agree to meet your need or will agree to provide you with whatever you want. But we do get to express our wants and needs. Wants and needs, the other side of it is having the courage to say both yes and no. And you know what? You don't have to over explain your answer. You don't have to justify yourself. You don't have to justify your no. So, with boundaries, we're establish them and responding to others' boundaries based on wants and needs. Another aspect here that is important to look at is boundaries are a way that we demonstrate that we have self-respect. Um, Sometimes if we walk around and our boundaries are too porous, it can almost appear as if we aren't caring for ourselves or that we don't respect ourselves. And, boundaries exist, in relationships between people. And so it's also really important, in healthy relationships that we learn to respect the other's boundaries or other people's boundaries. So a part of that respect is going to be honoring what they've asked for and not trying to take advantage of someone's kindness or their generosity. Um, Self-respect, kind of back to home here with ourselves. Another aspect of respecting boundaries is this, and not giving too much in hopes that someone will like you, and not allowing someone to take advantage of your kindness or generosity. So that learning to say no. So this area of boundaries and how it's really connected to self-respect and also respect for others. Boundaries also help us preserve our self-identity. Um, with boundaries, we're able to establish these lines that will help us maintain our personal values. We're able to establish these guidelines and rules that will allow us to continue to focus on our own personal growth while we're involved with others. Okay, so um, I kind of smiled when I read this because I know this was something that I struggled with when I was young, remembering that it was okay for me to continue on with my personal growth while I was involved in a relationship. Um, Through trusting your own decisions, making your very own decisions that align with your values and help you stay focused on your growth, that's a part of preserving self identity. And then also defining the truth as you see it, knowing that you have a right to your own opinions. So, boundaries, wow, they help us get clear about our wants and needs. They help us understand our own respect, and they help us preserve our self identity. So I've had this in my PowerPoint presentations for a long time. I just think it's really good. I wish somebody would have given this to me when I was, probably about the same age as a lot of you. Um, it says, you have the right to be treated with respect. You have the right to say no without feeling guilty. You have the right to make a mistake. You have the right to ask for what you want and need. It doesn't mean you will necessarily get it, but you have the right to ask. You have the right to express your feelings and opinions. And I probably would also add the word appropriately there. You have the right to change your mind. You have the right to feel good about yourself no matter what others say. And you have the right to act in your own best interest if you don't violate others in the process. So if you like this, take a picture of this, keep it with you and your phone, remind yourself of this all the time, especially if you know that you're a person that struggles a bit with porous boundaries. And those porous boundaries, again, are, maybe not sticking up for yourself and not maintaining self identity quite as much as you'd probably like to. So, benefits of setting boundaries, I think, probably the big benefit is this beginning to feel more empowered, more like you are in the driver's seat of your own bus, you're in charge of your life. And one of the ways that you can take charge of your life is by speaking up and setting those boundaries. If you set healthy boundaries, there's going to be a lot less drama and stress in your life. You're going to feel more confident. You're going to like yourself better. You're also going to increase the chances that you'll actually reach those goals that you've set. If you just think about that one area of boundaries that's related to time, if you're doing a good job with your time boundaries, it's it's going to be a lot easier for you to reach those goals. And just one that I'm thinking about is making it through this semester and tackling your courses with good grades. It's really important to be able to set those time boundaries. So those are just a few benefits. And what I'm leaving you with is just kind of this prompt. What is one thing that you could do now to create healthier boundaries in your relationships? Is there something you want to ask for? Is there a no that you want to express? Or is there something that you just really need to speak up about that is actually going to demonstrate greater self respect? And this is something that you might consider doing is at the end of this, if you've realized there are any boundary adjustments that you'd like to make with friends, family, or a partner, Really sitting down and identifying what boundary is being crossed, and then identifying the action that you would like to take. And here's the example. A classmate has made a habit of telling me jokes that are racially or sexually degrading. These comments are at odds with my values and beliefs and are causing me to dread being around him. I bet all of you can relate to a situation like this. It may not be the exact same types of comments, but I think this is one of those situations that probably most of us have found ourselves in. We don't like the conversation that's occurring or the comments that are occurring. And this in this particular example, it's the boundary violation. It's related to your values and your beliefs. So the plan of action, I plan to discuss the jokes and comments with my classmate and let him know they make me feel uncomfortable and that I would prefer not to hear those types of jokes in the future. So the next presentation this week is related to assertiveness. How you can actually now, after you've identified a boundary that's being crossed and what you would like to do, how you can put this into words. How you can make this really assertive statement and express yourself in a way that's going to be appropriate and clear and firm. Those are aspects of assertiveness. So that will be the next lecture. Okay, hope you have an excellent remainder of your day.